Hi everyone, this is CJ with Cycletron. Today I want to talk about Indian Motorcycles. Indian Motorcycles is a part of a much larger company, which is Polaris. I want to talk about what they're up to, how does their motorcycle market look, how does it look in comparison to, say, Harley Davidson, what are the trends, what are their strengths, what are their weaknesses, what things are they doing right, what things do they need to improve upon. So it's going to be a complete overall marketing overview as well as financial overview and just more or less what people think about it in terms of the comments that I see on the channel. So let's get started. Alright, so the financial information I'm using comes from Polaris's 2022 earnings call, really the fourth quarter, but they do an overview of the entire year for 2022. And we can see that Polaris overall has $8.6 billion in revenue, which is a 15% increase over the full year 2021. You compare that to Harley Davidson with a total revenue of $5.7 billion, which was up 8% over 2021. And I'll come back to this in a bit, but look at the bottom line number for Polaris. They generated over $10.40 per share in earnings. Polaris generated over $1 billion in earnings before income taxes, amortization, depreciation, and other expenses. Now, I know most of you realize that Polaris sells side-by-sides and ATVs in addition to the street motorcycles through Indian Motorcycle. I was surprised at just how big the off-road sales are. I mean, it's 6-to-1 off-road versus on-road. So we can see here from their annual report, sales were $6.4 billion for off-road, $1.1 billion for on-road, and about $1 billion for boats. If you just take a snapshot of the fourth quarter 2022, Polaris's on-road sales were up 29% over the prior year, year to year. Off-road was up about 19% year over year. As I mentioned earlier, Harley Davidson's total revenue was $5.7 billion for 2022, and $3.8 billion of that revenue came from selling motorcycles. And we can see that Harley made a little less than half of Polaris in terms of earnings per share at $4.96. Both companies have pretty similar operating income, around $800 million for Polaris and $900 million for Harley Davidson. Now, there's another thing I want to point out on this slide. Harley Davidson sold a total of 178,500 motorcycles worldwide in 2022. 133,000 of those were here in North America. Harley Davidson has about 24% of the total U.S. market share in motorcycles, which is about the same percentage of all the smaller motorcycle brands, including Indian Motorcycle, lumped together. So what we're seeing here is that Indian Motorcycle is going to comprise a much smaller market than Harley Davidson, not only worldwide, but particularly here in the United States, which pretty much everybody knows, but I'm going to go through the specific numbers. Now, the 600 plus cc heavy motorcycle segment, or large motorcycle segment, Harley's market share dropped from 45% in 2021 to 41% in 2020. That, in all likelihood, is in part due to increased sales with Indian Motorcycle. It's hard to come by sales totals for Indian Motorcycles, but I did find this article. It was actually published overseas that indicates that Indian Motorcycle sold the record number of bikes in 2019, which is the last quote-unquote normal business year that pretty much anybody had. But then last year, in 2022, they were down to a little over 30,000 motorcycles. So that's a big drop. And that drop is associated mostly with supply chain problems that seems to have really impacted Indian Motorcycle, more so even than Harley Davidson. We saw from a previous slide that Harley Davidson's worldwide motorcycle production was around 193,000 motorcycles in 2021 and down to 178,000 in 2022. So in rough numbers, Indian Motorcycle sells one motorcycle for every 5 motorcycles that Harley Davidson sells. So not nearly at the same scale Harley is in terms of production, but not insignificant either, particularly when you consider the fact that Harley Davidson's now pushing $3,700 in profit per motorcycle sold. So if you take 30,000 motorcycles off the table that Harley might otherwise have sold, now obviously they're not everybody who wanted to buy an Indian, let's say they couldn't, and had to buy a Harley instead. Obviously, they're going to buy other brands of motorcycles. Maybe they don't buy anything at all if the Indian motorcycle is particularly appealing to them. But you can tell that, I mean, even at a conservative estimate of 20,000 motorcycles sold by Indian come at the expense of Harley Davidson, we're talking over $100 million in lost revenue or lost profit to Harley Davidson, represented by the competition from Indian Motorcycle. So let's just take a step back from the financials and just look at the big picture. Polaris is a much more diversified company than Harley Davidson. So you've got the off-road, the marine, and on-road divisions, not unlike what you had when AMF owned Harley Davidson back in the 70s. So despite the quality issues that they had back in the 70s with Harley Davidson motorcycles, they still were able to survive through a diversified product line, and I think that's a real strength that Polaris has right now. The other strength that Polaris has is that, take Indian Motorcycle in particular, and thanks to Gene Clark for his comments that got me thinking along these lines, they're a much more youthful company than Harley Davidson. Despite Indian's marketing suggesting they've been around since 1901, well, the name's been around since 1901. Harley's, of course, started in 1903, but the current incarnation of Indian motorcycles only been around for 10 years, since 2013. And Indian in general is pretty technologically advanced, thanks to Victory Motorcycles, which was also owned by Polaris, and Polaris decided to shut that line of motorcycles down in 2017. There's a rather abrupt announcement in January of 2017 saying, hey, we're done. We'll continue to make parts for another 10 years to support your Victory motorcycle purchase, but adios. And that didn't go down too well with a lot of people. In fact, I was looking at buying a Victory motorcycle right when that happened. So, you know, I think some people took a big hit on resale value just because generally people don't want to buy a motorcycle that's been discontinued and worry about getting parts. So the thing with Victory was they're a lot more innovative and incorporated a lot more technology compared to, say, Harley Davidson relative to liquid cooling and more performance. And it's really a shame that Victory didn't keep going. Obviously, there's a lot of Victory DNA in the current Indian motorcycle lineup. You've got multiple liquid-cooled motorcycles. You have multiple liquid-cooled motorcycle models coming from Indian, the Challenger, the Pursuit, the FTR, and so on. So, you know, it took Harley Davidson quite a bit of time before they got around to releasing the Pan America, the Sportster S, the Nightster. All of those are liquid-cooled motorcycles. Also, I think for many years, Indian Motorcycles was recognized for their superior infotainment system. I know Harley's upped their game in response quite a bit. I used to have a 2019 Street Glide Special, and I like the infotainment system on that, but what I've seen in the showroom for the Indian motorcycles, I think they're just a little cut above. Again, as I got comments from Gene about some articles he read about Indian Motorcycle, a lot of people in the industry think that they're just sort of coasting right now, that they've taken their foot off the gas, as it were. I mean, they still make very good motorcycles. They're still innovative, but they seem to be coasting a little bit. They could do so much more with their model lineup and by introducing additional models, I think. And I think they've got too many of certain models already. It's a little confusing. And I think their naming is confusing. I used to think Harley naming with all the alphabet soup was hard to keep track of. Of course, every Harley had a common name as well as the letter designation. But I have a really hard time with tracking the Indian models just in my head. You know, you've got the Chieftain, the Scout, a lot of Indian-related names, but there's just so much segmentation that they have in their own model line for a given bike. The other thing that's happening with Indian Motorcycle is they've had a notice out to their dealers basically saying, hey, get rid of all your merchandise that's got the Indian Head logo with a tinted face on it. You can see the redesigned ones now are all red or just monochromatic. And that's just the general trend with companies getting away from marketing based on a particular race or ethnic group. It's an out-of-date thing. Even though a lot of people associate the brand with that iconic image, and some people say, well, why are you messing with that? But brands change over time. It's just marketing. But I just think it's ironic that if Indian Motorcycle is transitioning away from their historical color scheme on their logo, what's to say that in the future they won't eliminate the headdress logo altogether? And the real irony of that is they would basically become Victory motorcycles again. That was the main reason that they killed off Victory, was to focus strictly on Indian Motorcycle. And if you look at the nuts and bolts and the DNA of the bikes, they're not that much different from what Victory was already doing. So I think Indian Motorcycle needs to emphasize the fact that they're a younger company. They've got more flexibility. They're just taking it to Harley in the Battle of the Baggers. And the thing that Indian Motorcycle did, which I thought was really cool, is they created a race replica of their winning Bagger Series motorcycles. And they're selling 29 limited edition, by definition, of that particular bike for $93,000. And in terms of functionality, it's the same bike as what they've developed for the racetrack. And you don't see Harley Davidson doing anything like that. So I think Indian Motorcycle needs to keep doing more of that, play to their strengths, and not coast so much. Another disadvantage that Indian Motorcycle has is they only have about 200 dealers in the United States versus around 600 for Harley Davidson. So with Indian Motorcycle, you typically will have a dealer in major U.S. cities. With Harley, you've got typically more than one dealership in a given metro area and more further afield. And I think you can have a situation, depending on where you live, where the next Indian dealership is going to be pretty far from where you live. And also causes some people concern if they're taking long road trips. Usually they know that if they have a breakdown or need a part or something like that, they're probably within 100 miles of a Harley dealership. And they may be 300 miles or more from the nearest Indian Motorcycle dealership. So there's that consideration as well. So I'd be interested in what you think. Have you gone into an Indian Motorcycle showroom lately? What's your overall impression? Another thing that's, I think, an advantage, but I don't have enough experience to know how prevalent this is, but it doesn't seem like the Indian Motorcycle dealers are gouging their customers or charging big surcharges. I do think there is a small surcharge, just like Harley Davidson has, but it's the dealer surcharges where the Harley dealers are really socketing it to their customers. And I don't think the Indian Motorcycle dealers are doing that. If you have information to the contrary, please drop it in the comments section. But that could be a big differentiator for them. But the thing is, you're not going to really save a lot of money by buying an Indian versus a Harley Davidson. The lowest price Indian Harley models are around $13,000, $14,000 and go well up above $30,000. Again, comparing the two companies, Indian Motorcycle hasn't done much for an electric play, where Harley's been involved with their Livewire division for many years now, and makes what many people consider to be a premium electric motorcycle product. It's just the fact that most people don't want electric motorcycles that's a problem. So maybe Indian's a lot like Toyota, where Toyota's largely set out on production of EVs in favor of hydrogen and other technologies, and just views electric vehicles as just part of the mix and not going in it big time like, say, other manufacturers are, or say Harley is relative to motorcycling. So those are my thoughts on this topic. Please let me know what you think in the comments section, and please stay tuned for future videos. Thanks very much.